And it was at GM's Pontiac division that DeLorean first made his mark with the legendary GTO.
And the formula was simple. Take a boring mid-sized car like the Pontiac Tempest, drop in a huge V8 the size of Arkansas and stand back. The result turned Pontiac from maker of grandmother's gadabouts to some of the hottest cars on the street. DeLorean had a big success on his hands.
He'd become an auto industry celebrity, a glamorous wife on his arm and a string of Hollywood chums. But by '73, it was too much for the establishment on the top floor of GM's HQ. He may have been vice president of car and truck, but he was seen as a maverick who liked to top up his salary by wheeling and dealing on company time. With too many fingers in too many pies, they had to let him go. But the man had a plan.
DeLorean knew that Americans were sick to the back teeth of Detroit's cynicism. They'd buy a brand new car, drive it out of the showroom, only to find their tails being chased by next year's model. It was planned-in obsolescence. So he promised an ethical sports car, a car that wouldn't be replaced every year, that didn't rust away to nothing in no time at all, and paid more than just lip service to consumer safety. John DeLorean was going to take the US auto industry and turn it upside down.
DeLorean's original design was indeed ambitious, with stainless steel panels, gull-wing doors and cutting-edge safety features like airbags and a crash-resistant plastic understructure. Italian designer Giorgetto Giugiaro wrapped it all up in a futuristic body shape. And by '77, the first running prototype was finished. DeLorean immediately used it to garner interest from prospective dealers and customers, who promptly went crazy.
I was fortunate enough to have this car on my showroom floor for a few days, the prototype.
He also needed a factory to build it. After rejecting sites across the US, DeLorean was tantalizingly close to signing a deal with Puerto Rico. Then, at the last minute, the Irish Development Agency made him a better offer, and Johnny was off to Limerick. But the Irish had the good sense to conduct a feasibility study and backed off fast.
DeLorean then goes into a sulk and tells everybody he's going to do the deal with the Puerto Rican government. Until that is, he hears of some rather attractive terms being offered by the Northern Ireland Development Agency. They say they're going to give him £55 million up front in return for an investment from him of just £546,000. The deal works like this. For every £100 the British taxpayer chucks in, all DeLorean has to find is just £1. The man does it again.
By the end of '78, the factory was well underway on a greenfield site between Catholic and Protestant housing estates in Dunmurry, Belfast. But the promised car was still nowhere near production ready.
Which is why DeLorean came here, to the Lotus factory in Norfolk. He wanted Lotus's boss, Colin Chapman, to productionize the DeLorean. Now, Chapman was none too keen, especially when he knew that it had to be done in less than 2 years. But Lotus wanted the consultancy work and also wanted the money. And DeLorean was offering a contract worth nearly £10 million.
When Lotus engineers took delivery of the prototype, they didn't exactly jump up and down. The body was as stiff as jelly, and it handled like a duck on an ice rink. Chapman pressed for a mid-engined layout, but DeLorean wanted to woo the swinging bachelor with room behind the seats for a set of golf clubs. DeLorean wouldn't budge, and the engine was banished to the back. And that's not all.
DeLorean had boasted endlessly about the car's ability to withstand crashes, and key to that was a new form of technology called ERM, elastic reservoir molding. He wanted the whole underside made out of this. But Lotus took one look at it and said this will not work, and binned it, reverting instead to resin technology and a conventional chassis. So all those much-vaunted promises that DeLorean had made about the car being technically audacious, gradually, one by one, they were disappearing into the ether.
To fix the floppy body, Chapman's team simply grafted on the steel backbone from their own Esprit. As time went on, the car's design owed less and less to DeLorean and more to Lotus.
John DeLorean's dream was very much based on this premise of providing a safer motor car, a more fuel-efficient motor car, something that would almost last forever, very competitive in the marketplace. The reality, unfortunately, because of the limitations on the powertrain and the configuration and so on, was very different, and we never, ever achieved the dream.
But Johnny wasn't worried. He was more interested in managing money. The company that ran the Belfast factory was based in New York, and he owned 84% of it. The British government may have co-owned Dunmurray, but they couldn't touch him in the States, where he paid himself a whopping $500,000 a year.
He had a very much of a jet-setting lifestyle. He had apartments in New York. He had several ranches at the time. He had a very expensive way of running his end of the business.
Back in Belfast, the factory was ready, but the car wasn't. In a panic stab at durability testing, cars were driven round the clock until bits broke or fell off. DeLorean knew it took 5 years to get a car into production, yet he was pushing for 2. Despite the best efforts of the workforce, it was a deadline that inevitably brought a blizzard of problems.
The car was brought into production sooner, in my opinion, than it should have been, with insufficient time to really develop the production problems out. So there were quite a few problems involved with the actual build quality of the cars. The result of that was that, I couldn't tell you how many, but the first several hundred were completely stripped and rebuilt in America before they went to the customer.
In March '81, just 3 months after production started, the DMC 12 was launched at the Geneva Motor Show.
The expectations for any vehicle that would really wow the public, it would have to be something very special, and this vehicle clearly was not that. The motoring press were generally nonplussed by the car. It was underpowered, it was an old design. Giugiaro had actually penned the thing 5 or 6 years earlier, and it hadn't changed or been updated very much. It really wasn't a sterling piece at all.
And if the motor moguls over there in downtown Detroit had been worried about John DeLorean's brave new car, they needn't have, because it was a sham. He'd promised airbags, he'd promised a plastic monocoque, he'd promised it would be cutting edge. It wasn't. GM would have made this car better. The doors, the much vaunted gull-wing doors, never ever worked. The struts were too weak, it never went all the way up. And because they were so complicated, the window wouldn't go down completely, so you had this letterbox slot in the door, making the interior feel like solitary confinement in Alcatraz. The engine, it wasn't DeLorean's own, it was a warmed-over Renault 2.8-litre V6 out of the Renault 30. It produced, in American spec, a piffling, an inconsequential 130 brake horsepower. We're not talking quality here. Far from it. So apart from the futuristic stainless steel shell, underneath it was all very orthodox, very mediocre, and really rather dull. A bit like the driving experience. It really does feel like a tomb in here. It's dark, it's oppressive, it's claustrophobic, and a very plasticky tomb at that. Look at this window switch. There's no headroom. Anybody over 6 foot, and you've got to wear a cushion on your head because you're constantly hitting the roof. Lotus might have sorted out the handling for the European versions, but for the American ones, they had to put squishy boulevard springs on them. But worst of all, it was supposed to cost just $12,000, which would have been great. But by the time it hit showroom carpets, it was listing at over 26 grand, putting it up against some very serious and capable opposition. Which would have been fine if the thing had been competitive, but it wasn't. Compared to titans like the Mercedes SL and the Porsche 911, it was hopeless. By the time the federal spec emission pipery was bolted onto the feeble Renault engine, it had all the performance of a rampaging glacier. You could throw a cat through the panel gaps and the interior just crumbled to the touch. It was perfume on a pig, but for a while, nobody noticed that the Emperor was in the buff.
The brouhaha fueled an initial burst in sales and premiums were being paid. For the first 6 months, it even outsold Porsche. DeLorean was predicting sales of 10,000 a year.
Oh, it was very, very exciting. And, of course, we always had mobs of people that were crowding around it. We had several invitations to take the car to car shows because nobody had ever seen it. So it was really a showstopper.
Live the dream. Drive the DeLorean today.